about the Armchair Historian. Yeah, send me the video. I have it. How Prussia ended the French Empire, which we just did. Let me just open my phone. Why not? I can just open it. Let me parallel open the game to see where we were. And yeah, this is where I'm at the game right now. I just on France, and I want to learn what's going on about
Internet.
A lot of
In
potential.
1805, Napoleon Bonaparte delivered a coup de grace to the Holy Roman Empire at the Battle of Austerlitz, where the combined forces of Russia and Austria were decisively defeated by his smaller army. This victory established the French Empire as the dominant military power of the continent, pioneering new innovations in infantry tactics and artillery that left the rest of Europe in the dust. Napoleon swiftly reorganized the shattered remnants of the Holy Roman Empire into a French vassal and turned his attention to larger matters. In the end, it took the nations of Europe 23 years and 7 coalitions to bring revolutionary France down in 1815.
Jesus, man.
However, within a generation, a second French empire was founded by Napoleon's nephew, but in contrast to his uncle's military success, Napoleon III's empire was dismantled in a little over 6 weeks. It could be argued that the Prussian leadership carried the legacy of French military innovation seen in the Napoleonic Wars better than the French themselves in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. Internet, it's more important than ever to stay safe and anonymous online. Luckily for me, Surfshark VPN ensures that my data is safe and secure.
We use VPNs, right? But VPN is great if like a TV show doesn't play in your country. Like Lisa and me are big fans of a TV show called The Handmaid's Tale, which is not out in Germany. You just use VPN and then you fucking have it, man. Quite nice.
Use my code HISTORIAN to get 83% off plus free. Links are in the description below. Surfshark offers a 30-day. With the formation of the North German Confederation in 1867, Europe had a new power to contend with. The Austro-Prussian War, the year prior, saw a David and Goliath struggle between the Kingdom of Prussia and the Empire of Austria for control over the German-speaking states, which resulted in a clear victory for Prussia.
That's literally what we just did in the game.
And the formation of the North German Confederation. Legendary Prussian statesman Otto von Bismarck was chiefly responsible for this conflict, having carefully manipulated events to ensure that his modern, prosperous state took the lead in German affairs, instead of the ethnically divided and militarily outmoded Austria. But Prussia's sudden return to international prominence did not go unnoticed by its perennial adversary, France. Emperor Charles Louis Napoleon III was constantly trying to emulate the deeds of his more famous uncle, and had even timed his coup against the former Republican government to coincide with the story.
And that must suck, he always wanted to imitate Napoleon I.
Seeing Prussia's rapid expansion as a threat to the balance of power in Europe, Napoleon III's cabinet ministers urged him to demand territorial concessions along the west bank of the Rhine to fortify France's eastern border. This was precisely what Bismarck wanted. A number of German states had yet to join the nascent North German Confederation, and Bismarck believed that a war with France would be necessary to coax them into the fold and complete the unification of Germany. Bismarck rejected Napoleon III's demands out of hand, and the French emperor proved all too eager to walk straight into Bismarck's traps.
So that's... Oh, what does FR mean? Yeah, you guys know everything. Why FR? Why would on a Prussian hat be an FR? Föderale Republik? No, bullshit. Frederikus Rex. France. Yeah, on the German helmet it says France, eh?
The stage was set for a war that would redefine the
Everyone is saying something else. I can't trust
political balance of Europe. The French and German militaries represented some of the best soldiers on the continent, both of which had recent victories, the former against Russia and Austria, and the latter against Austria and Denmark.
So we're going to hear just real quick. Man, the animations are really good. Look at that. Like the bracket thing they did, it's so cool. Like it's so creative. Man, anyways, back to the video. I just wanted to say that. So good.
The French army was a professional organization that employed selective conscription for long service periods, with benefits offered to those choosing to re-enlist.
So it means Frederikus Rex, which means Friedrich der Große, the old king. Okay.
Meanwhile, the German military was built upon the foundation of universal conscription for a much shorter service period. As was common at the time, both nations only kept a fraction of their men under arms during peace, relying on their trained reserves to quickly fill the ranks when war broke out. Under the French system, this allowed for a reserve of around 400,000 professional soldiers, while the Germans could call upon a veritable human ocean of over 1 million conscripts.
Jesus Christ.
The key, of course, was getting all of them armed and shipped to the front lines in an orderly fashion.
Always weird to think, man, that probably many years ago, one of my ancestors was one of these guys. Isn't that super interesting to think? Like, you know your parents, you know your grandparents, and you kind of know your great-grandparents, but you don't know your ancestors in the year 1800 or something. Or makes you always wonder, right, what they... Sometimes I wish Assassin's Creed was real and you go to that fucking chair and you can relive all your ancestors, man. The problem is, right, that you have so many ancestors, right? mom and dad, boom. Then you have 2 grandmas, 2 grandpas, and then boom, it's like 2, 4, 8, 16. It's after 20 years, man, there's just so many answers.
From the outset, both sides knew that early action would prove decisive. Under pressure from his military planners to strike before the Germanic horde could assemble, Napoleon left Paris on the 28th.
His force represented around 200k of France's 288k active personnel at the start of the war and was expected to gather strength as it marched. In practice, most men got lost on the countryside thanks to a lack of maps and coordination. Most men got lost in the countryside because they couldn't find the army.
Of July 1870 to command the Army of the Rhine, which marched east to invade Germany and liberate the southern states from Prussian oppression. Of course, this again played directly into Bismarck's hands, as the southern states had declared themselves for Prussia the moment they had received word of French mobilization. But such details would be irrelevant if the North German Confederation failed to secure victory. The opening shots of the war were fired on the 2nd of August, when the French Second Corps, under the command of General Charles Froissart, crossed the border and attacked the town of Saarbrücken, which his scouts had informed him was defended only by a single, isolated regiment. Froissart had good reason to be confident, as his troops were armed with breech-loading, bolt-action chassepot rifles. The Germans, on the other hand, used the Dreisse needle rifle, a decades older and less effective model than the chassepot.
10 years
older. In
older.
the skirmishes that followed, the French rifle proved itself a far superior weapon in most respects, especially in terms of accuracy at
French mitrailleux guns could have been a lot more destructive had the French implemented them correctly. However, they were kept in the rear with field artillery. So what we're kind of seeing here is that Napoleon III and his generals were really not that competent.
Long range. The French also deployed the terrifying mitrailleuse, a multi-barreled volley gun capable of firing up to 125 high-caliber rounds.
Some French even assembled in Algiers instead of North France.
Thanks to these advantages, the Second Corps easily captured the town despite stiff resistance. Emboldened by this early success, Napoleon III was eager to continue the offensive, only to be stunned by reports of a German army advancing south across the border towards the town of Wissembourg, which was defended by the 5,000 men of the French First Corps under General Abel Douay. Despite being horribly outnumbered, the First Corps fought bravely, using their complement of mitrailleuse guns to carve bloody swaths in the ranks of the attackers. But when German artillery fire killed General Douay, the terrified civilians threw open the gates and hoisted a white flag of surrender. But the French soldiers fought on, firing from rooftops onto the horde of German soldiers pouring into the town. This bloody house-to-house fighting continued until German artillery closed to point-blank range, threatening to annihilate the remaining defenders. Only then did the First Corps surrender.
We don't really have FPS games about this era, right? I know there's some, I know, but like a big known FPS game in this era, you don't really have that. I mean, would be kind of weird, right? Kids nowadays, they want their fucking cool updates on their gun, and this game will just be, okay, I gotta reload, give me 1 minute. I missed again. Give me another minute, man. I know.
In response to this shocking turn of events, Napoleon hurriedly entrusted Marshal Patrice Macmon with command of his 3 southernmost army corps and dispatched them to engage the Germans as they advanced deeper into French territory. But unbeknownst to Napoleon, this was only one of 3 German armies that had been assembled at the border since mid-July. This feat of military logistics was all thanks to Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke, widely regarded as the finest military mind of his generation. Since the early 1860s, German general staff officers had been traveling throughout France, surveying terrain, creating excellent maps, some of which rivaled French-made maps of their own country, and calculating the available food supplies of every fortress.
That is genius, man. It's so interesting how putting in the work was so important in war, right? They traveled before the war, made maps, and had food supply data.
And town in the north.
This is the original league back then. Which league, man? This is the fucking Franco-Prussian League, dude. That was a league.
Northeastern part of the country, allowing Moltke to rush his reserves to the border far faster than the French had ever anticipated. Ignorant of these facts, Macmahon's 45,000 men.
French mobilization plans were a disaster. Soldiers wandered hither and thither across the nation, some even traveling all the way to rally points in Corsica and Algeria before realizing their mistake. How does that even happen, man? Oh, well, it's literally at the other end of the empire.
Marched southeast, taking up defensive positions on a heavily wooded ridgeline near the town of Vert, which provided clear lines of fire across the open fields beyond. As the Germans marched forward, they were subjected to a withering barrage of the morale-crushing mitrailleuse guns, while chassepot rifles dealt most of the real damage, picking off stragglers at ranges that the needle rifle simply could not match. But while the French held the line against the enemy infantry, they found themselves at the mercy of German artillery. To his horror, MacMahon realized that the supposedly invincible French artillery corps was completely outclassed by the new Krupp-designed cannon, which employed state-of-the-art fuses and breech-loading mechanisms to fire faster and more accurately than the French muzzleloaders. In the face of incessant barrages, the French were forced to flee the field, having suffered nearly 20,000 casualties in a matter of hours. Further west, things had been going just as badly for the French Second Corps. On the same day, MacMahon engaged the Prussian Third Army near Wörth. General Froissart was in a pitched battle with the 1st and 2nd Prussian armies near Spicheren. Soon after the action commenced, Froissart noticed that his positions were being quickly surrounded and overwhelmed. This was a result of German infantry tactics, which favored independent platoons attacking.
The French underestimated the ability of the German platoons to operate independently. Being spread out in isolated units also prevented the Germans from suffering moral shocks and mass panics from sudden casualties. Genius.
From multiple directions. The French hoped to counter this with tight defensive formations and massed firepower, but these were vulnerable to being encircled by the much better coordinated German units. Although he recognized this issue, all of Froissart's efforts to coordinate his troops and request reinforcements were frustrated by poor lines of communication, and by evening he was forced to order a withdrawal to the south. When the news of these twin disasters reached his ears, a shell-shocked Napoleon III ordered the Army of the Rhine into an unceremonious retreat to Metz, abandoning most of eastern France to German occupation. With his dreams of glory shattered, the distraught emperor begrudgingly yielded command of his remaining forces to Marshal François-Achille Bazaine, who promptly began bickering with the rest of the general staff over what to do next. This resulted in the French taking over a week to cross the River Moselle, giving the Germans numerous opportunities to delay them further. In fact, the French retreated even slower than the Germans had calculated. And when 30,000...
I sometimes imagine in history when you have a great leader of a country, like in this case Napoleon III, and this happens to you, how that must feel like. Like, imagine you're the leader of a country, a big historical figure, you know, whatever, and you sit in your room and someone walks in and says, "Hey man, we're fucked," and you sit there and realize, dude, I'm going down in history as the guy who fucked this up, man. That must feel, wow. That must feel bad, dude.
Men of the Prussian Second Army were sent to harass the French rearguard near the village of Maz-la-Tour. They instead found themselves confronted by an entire enemy army.
Jesus Christ. Look, I don't want to celebrate him, but I sometimes don't know what must Hitler have felt like when he realized, dude, this is not going my way. There must have been so much fear and anxiety in this human being, man. Well, there's great other examples when George does something, when he realized he's losing America and stuff. That must really do something with you, man.
Events should have resulted in a decisive victory for Bazaine, and the brave marshal demonstrated his valor by throwing himself into the center of the action. Unfortunately, this isolated him from the chain of command, leaving the other French officers involved in the battle to act on their own initiative, something they were completely unprepared for. Sensing chaos among the enemy ranks, the outnumbered Germans took the offensive, culminating in a reckless charge by 2 heavy cavalry regiments against the French artillery positions. This act of suicidal bravery, later dubbed the Death Ride, cost half of the 800 horsemen their lives.
Wow. Sounds like the director of Rohirrim.
Successfully silenced the French guns. Left unsupported, the French infantry were unable to break the thin German...
Unlike their French counterparts, Prussians encouraged leaders to think independently and creatively, which they called Auftragstaktik, rewarding good results over a rigid adherence to order as written. Genius.
...lines, which held despite being outnumbered almost 4-1. By the late afternoon, German reinforcements began to flow into the area, and Bazaine was forced with the horrible revelation that his men were simply too exhausted to continue trying to break out to the west. Left with no choice, he ordered a retreat back to Metz, hoping to at least rest and resupply. After the near disaster at Maz-la-Tour, Moltke opted for caution. While the Third Army continued its pursuit of MacMahon in the south, Moltke ordered the Second Army to advance toward the French positions on the Moselle and the village of Gravelotte. The two forces engaged shortly before noon on August 18th, with the French choosing to dig in and hold fast to their defensive lines. As in previous battles, many German attacks stalled in the face of superior French firepower, but Prussia dominated the artillery duel, with over 200 cannon laying waste to enemy positions and causing a mass rout at the village of Saint-Privat. Seeing disaster looming, French General Charles Bourbaki led the famed Imperial Guard to reinforce the line. But upon seeing his allies already fleeing, Bourbaki halted the advance, reportedly protesting, "You promised me victory, now you get me involved in a rout." When the rest of the French saw the Imperial Guard preparing to withdraw, their morale collapsed, and the entire army retreated in disarray behind the fortifications of Metz, where it was promptly...
In war, you have to think so much. We don't see that in video games, but you have to think so much about real-life morale of people. Not like Ork in Hoi 4, but you have to think about human morale. It's so important.
Circled and besieged. Despite suffering over 20,000 casualties compared to the French count of 12,000, the Battle of Gravelotte was a decisive victory for the Germans. The very next day, Moltke began enacting the next stage of his plan. German losses had been heavy, and General Steinmetz of the Prussian First Army had failed to trap the French Second Corps at Spicheren. So, with the stroke of a pen, Moltke replaced him. Such a casual dismissal of a high-ranking officer would have been unthinkable in the French army, which had been suffering a critical shortage of competent officers and was often crippled by favoritism and petty rivalries.
The Prussian general staff system was created specifically to address issues faced during the Napoleonic Wars. They sought to sack officers who paid for their commissions, focusing instead on men who could earn their ranks by merit.
Instituted into a new Fourth Army, which was sent marching west to link up with the Third Army and attack Marshal Macmahon, who was rallying his forces at Chalon. By this point, it had become clear to everyone in the French army that Napoleon III was gravely ill. The 61-year-old emperor had long suffered from numerous health conditions, but these had been kept a state secret. But now his troops could watch him hobbling about the camp in constant agony from a combination of advanced arthritis and gallstones. In a way, his condition mirrored the state of the French army, whose own weaknesses had been so starkly revealed in the recent battles. The selective conscription system had allowed any man with money to buy his way out of service, leaving nothing but the poorest illiterate dregs to fill the ranks. The few career soldiers remaining were either too old to be effective or had fallen victim to the rampant alcoholism that had plagued the military for years. But although he was completely outnumbered, Macmahon had to act. It was imperative mess be relieved, no matter the cost. Thus he drove his 120,000 exhausted, feckless soldiers into march on August 21st to the aid of Bazaine, doing his best to march along a course that would avoid contact with the Prussian armies. But Macmahon's efforts were doomed, and he was unable to do anything to prevent his force from being quickly spotted and shadowed by German cavalry patrols, which reported their location straight back to Moltke. Upon learning of this threat, Moltke simply ordered the 3rd and 4th armies to catch the much smaller French force in a pincer move. When he realized he was being pursued, Macmahon deployed his men in a defensive triangle near
the Battle of Sedan. I've heard that before. But I'm once again, I'm very uneducated about this area. Sedan was considered a mighty fortress in the 17th century. By the standards of the 1870s, it was completely obsolete, offering no protection from modern artillery and serving as little more than a cage to contain the defenders.
The obsolete 17th century fortress of Sedan, with the river and fortifications at his back. Summing up the situation, one of his subordinates famously remarked, "We are in a chamber pot, about to be on." Interestingly, the first ever photograph of active combat in history was taken during this battle, as a photographer stood on.
Wow, that is insane. This is a real life picture of real combat. Dude, you just stand in line and people get shot. Holy crap. Photographs in this era were not made with flash photography, but with the exposure method. By 1870, exposure times shortened, allowing photographers to capture live moments with less blur. Wow, it even has a fucking a thumb thingy on it. Dude, there was no cover. You just stand in a fucking row. I hope you don't get shot. Jeez,
a grassy hill overlooking the countryside with the French defenders. On September 1st, the Battle of Sedan began. The first shots were fired in the outlying village of Bazaine, where Bavarian troops encountered a motley collection of French soldiers, a contingent of Marines diverted from the Baltic, and armed civilians, all firing at them from rooftops, doorways, trees, and church steeples.
The house on the left
Caught by
still
surprise,
exists
the
today.
Bavarians were forced to commit to brutal house-to-house fighting that continued well into the afternoon. But while the outnumbered defenders of Bazaine continued to hold out, the rest of the Prussian army continued to methodically encircle Sedan, pushing the French back from their defensive positions and destroying any isolated units with concentrated artillery fire. Marshal Macmahon continued trying to rally his men and stage a breakout at La Moselle, but he was abruptly wounded in the fighting and had to withdraw from the battlefield. This led to a dispute in the chain of command, as when Macmahn's designated successor ordered a retreat, he was overruled by another general who had only just arrived from Paris under orders from the French Minister of War. With no way to establish a clear chain of command, the army dithered, losing all sense of direction. By the late afternoon, the village of Bazaine was finally taken by the Bavarians, who sustained nearly 4,000 casualties in the battle. With their southern positions now completely overrun, and the Prussian army crossing the river Moselle to the west, the French were slowly hemmed in on all sides and forced to retreat behind the walls of Sedan. But the French were not even afforded the dignity of a glorious last stand. Assaulting the walls, the Germans instead lined up over 400 guns on the heights outside the town and commenced a devastating bombardment.
Yeah. That must have sucked.
As the day wore on, Emperor Napoleon III began riding aimlessly back and forth among his troops, despondently hoping that a German shell would end his misery. Meanwhile, the French cavalry desperately tried to break out through enemy lines, but their charges were all repelled. Each time, despite suffering heavy losses, the cavalry reformed and charged again, prompting King Wilhelm to exclaim, "Ah, those brave men." At around 5 p.m., Napoleon finally realized that God had no intention of letting him commit suicide by artillery shell and raised a white flag over the citadel. By this late hour, the
And thus French culture was made.
French army had been
all but
annihilated as a fighting force, having lost all cohesion thanks to the merciless shelling that made any kind of counterattack or breakout an impossibility. Upon seeing that their thoroughly beaten enemy was finally surrendering, a Prussian representative was detached to meet with the emperor, and then returned to King Wilhelm bearing a message. Having been unable to die in the midst of my troops, there remains nothing for me but to deliver my sword into your majesty's hands. I am your majesty's true brother, Napoleon. As a heavy rainfall began, what remained of the French army marched out of their shattered fortress into captivity. Of the 124,000 that had begun the battle, 17,000 had been killed or wounded, a further 21,000 had been taken prisoner during the fighting, leaving only 83,000 to surrender along with their emperor. A mere 3,000 had escaped to the north, fleeing to Belgium, where they were promptly detained and disarmed. Rarely in French history had a defeat been so utter and complete, much less one fought on their home soil.
That is a fucking...
The defeat of Macmon and the capture of the emperor and the
George
loss of his
Wittenhauer,
entire army in the span of a single day was the death sentence for the Second French Empire. At this point, Napoleon III was deeply unpopular with many of his subjects, and the moment word of his capture reached Paris, an angry mob rose up and overthrew his government, declaring the beginning of the Third Republic. But despite the head of the new government, General Louis Trochu, boldly proclaiming that he would cede not an inch of our soil or a stone of our fortress, the reality was that France no longer had a strong enough army in the field. It was no longer a matter of if France would cede soil and stone, but how much. Yet, as they marched toward the capital, the German armies found themselves being constantly harassed by French partisans. These were the Francs-Tireurs, or Free Shooters, a militia force made up primarily from members of the pre-war French shooting clubs. In the end, their valiant efforts delayed the German advance long enough for an army of more than 400,000 men to assemble for the defense of Paris.
The French were like, okay, you can beat us in the northeast, but Paris, man? No. Damn.
Sadly, the majority were members of the Paris National Guard, which was barely more than a ragtag group of angry political dissidents. Only around 60,000 were actual soldiers, with another 100,000 being part of the Garde Mobile, which consisted of men who had paid their way out of conscription into the regular army. When the Germans reached Paris on the 17th of September, they effortlessly turned back a poorly organized sortie by the defenders and had the city completely encircled within 24 hours. During this initial conflict, the imperial palace at Versailles was captured, becoming the headquarters of the besieging army. All the way back at Metz, Marshal Bazaine and his men had been incredibly busy, starving to death. The German siege lines were unbreakable, and on October 27th, Bazaine finally surrendered his entire force of 133,000 into captivity. The only real French victory of the war occurred on November 9th, when 70,000 troops from the newly raised Army of Loire routed 20,000 Bavarians and liberated the city of Orléans. This inspired the defenders of Paris to keep fighting despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them, and even a days-long bombardment by German field artillery failed to break their spirits. But even as the citizen army continued to hold out, King Wilhelm I staged a grand coronation at the captured palace of Versailles on January 18th. This was the culmination of his and Bismarck's imperial ambitions and had been directly enabled by the very French invasion that had scared the southern German states into joining the Confederation. A week later, Bismarck demanded that the bombardment of Paris be intensified, and despite Moltke's objections, the new Kaiser granted his request. A battery of powerful Krupp siege guns was set up outside the city, and under Bismarck's direction, they began systematically reducing the French capital to a smoking pile of rubble. Faced with a choice between capitulation or annihilation, the provisional government chose the former, and the city finally surrendered on January 27th. At midnight, after agreeing terms with Bismarck, an armistice came into effect, which included provisions for an immediate ceasefire and the disarmament of all but a single French division. After just 6 months, the war was over.
6 months, man. In these times.
Despite being victorious in almost every single major engagement, the Germans had suffered substantial losses, totaling around 28,000 dead and 88,000 wounded. But French casualties had been far greater, over 150,000 dead, with at least the same number of wounded, and an astounding 723,000 captured. The civilian population was also devastated. with numerous towns and villages burnt to the ground in
this war
reprisal
bullshit, so many
for
fucking
partisan
people
attacks,
dying just
and tens of
because some
thousands
powerful
killed
people
during various
wanna do some
sieges.
power shit, man.
But the bloodshed didn't end there. On March 18th, a communist
Taking Paris
uprising
without
seized
meth?
control of the
Impressive.
capital and declared the Paris Commune, independent of the Third Republic. After hastily rebuilding their forces, with Bismarck's permission of course, the Republicans stormed the city and destroyed the Commune in what became known as the Bloody Week, between May the
But 6 months
21st and
into
the
6 weeks is
28th.
also good.
Meanwhile, the Germans were busy celebrating the formation of their powerful, prosperous new empire. Kaiser Wilhelm would go on to see his nation expand to the status of a world power, complete with extensive colonial holdings overseas. His counterpart, the unfortunate Napoleon III, would go into exile and never return to France.
Oh, that's a thing in
He
his
died
family.
3 years after the war, living just long enough to see the Republic place all of the blame for France's defeat squarely on his shoulders.
That must
On his
suck, man.
deathbed,
Imagine
the
that.
disgraced emperor reportedly whispered the words, "Isn't it true that we weren't cowards at Sedan?"
Very interesting. Truly a history lesson, man, that I kind of needed, man. I don't know much about this. And this is the German anthem back then. This isn't really any toss, right? Napoleon deferred. Why do I hear bus music? That's that picture. That's where when they coronated him in Versailles. I know, we have movie shit here. And what happened? Final question before we go back. Explain that to me. You guys know everything. Why did Germany change its national anthem? What happened? When did it happen? When did the national anthem become the one that we have today? After World War I, they got rid of all these nobles, and then okay. So let's see what happens here with France. And I really need 45 ships. I genuinely want to check out that German tree.